Highly ambitious people are often admired, respected, even envied, because they seem disciplined, driven, and endlessly focused on becoming better versions of themselves. Yet very few people stop to ask what this relentless forward motion quietly erases along the way, especially when it comes to love, intimacy, and emotional attachment. Behind the image of progress and success, there is often a psychological cost that does not show up on resumes or bank statements, a cost paid in emotional distance, fragile bonds, and relationships that slowly turn cold. This is not because ambitious people are inherently cruel or incapable of love, but because extreme ambition often grows from a place where survival anxiety quietly overrides emotional presence. And when that happens, attachment becomes difficult, and love begins to feel like a liability rather than a refuge. Extreme ambition is rarely a simple desire to improve. More often, it is a psychological pattern built on the repeated rejection of one's former self, where yesterday's identity is treated as something inadequate that must be discarded in order to justify tomorrow's progress. When a person lives this way for years, the mind becomes trained to equate the stability with danger and emotional continuity with stagnation, because staying the same feels like falling behind. This internal logic does not stop at careers or goals. It quietly extends into relationships, friendships, and intimacy, all of which depend on continuity, patience, and emotional presence. As a result, people with extreme ambition often experience an unconscious tension between attachment and advancement, where emotional bonds tied to older versions of themselves start to feel inconvenient, limiting, or misaligned with who they are trying to become. Over time, detachment becomes a psychological skill rather than a failure, and leaving people behind feels justified as part of growth, even when it creates emotional emptiness. This is why highly ambitious individuals may appear emotionally distant, not out of cruelty, but because their inner world has been structured around constant forward motion rather than emotional rootedness. Behind extreme ambition, there is often a powerful and unspoken force: survival anxiety, a persistent fear of becoming irrelevant, powerless, or unsafe in a world perceived as competitive and unforgiving. Unlike healthy motivation, survival anxiety does not calm the mind after success. It intensifies the need for control and achievement, pushing the individual to work harder, aim higher, and rest less. In this psychological state, emotional needs are quietly deprioritized, not because they are unimportant, but because they do not provide immediate protection against perceived threats to self-worth or security. Love, intimacy, and emotional bonding require vulnerability and emotional exposure, which directly contradict the hyper-vigilant mindset shaped by survival anxiety. As a result, highly ambitious people may unconsciously treat relationships as optional or secondary, something to be managed after stability is secured, even though that sense of security never fully arrives. Over time, achievement becomes a coping mechanism rather than a source of fulfillment, and emotional distance becomes the price paid for maintaining a sense of control in an internally unstable world. Pursuing ambition at an extreme level is not only demanding in terms of time and effort, but also deeply exhausting on an emotional and cognitive level, even when the person appears calm, confident, and highly functional from the outside. Constant self-monitoring, long-term planning, competition, and internal pressure consume a large portion of mental energy, leaving little room for emotional responsiveness, empathy, and attunement to others. In this state, emotional presence does not disappear dramatically. Instead, it fades slowly, replaced by efficiency, emotional minimalism, and a preference for problem-solving over emotional understanding. Highly ambitious individuals often do not realize this depletion because they have learned to operate under chronic emotional fatigue, interpreting numbness as discipline and emotional restraint as maturity. However, intimacy requires sustained emotional availability, patience during emotional fluctuations, and the ability to tolerate vulnerability without immediately seeking control. When these capacities are depleted, partners may experience the relationship as one-sided, emotionally cold, or subtly neglectful, even if no overt harm is intended. Over time, the relationship begins to feel emotionally undernourished, not because love is absent, but because the ambitious individual's emotional resources have been continuously redirected towards survival, performance, and self-optimization rather than connection. When achievement becomes the primary source of self-worth, relationships often shift from emotional spaces into functional structures designed to stabilize identity and reduce anxiety. Rather than relating to a partner as a separate emotional being, highly ambitious individuals may unconsciously evaluate relationships based on usefulness, compatibility with long-term goals, or their ability to enhance status and self-esteem. Affection, support, and commitment become subtly conditional, offered in exchange for stability, admiration, or emotional regulation, rather than arising from mutual vulnerability. This transactional orientation is rarely deliberate. It develops gradually as the mind learns to associate safety with control and value with performance. As a result, emotional intimacy loses its spontaneity and begins to feel strategic, measured, and contingent upon outcomes. Partners may sense that love must be earned or maintained through constant self-adjustment, leading to emotional strain and insecurity. Over time, what once felt like connection turns into a quiet negotiation, where emotional closeness is tolerated only as long as it does not interfere with ambition, control, or the pursuit of external validation. Highly ambitious individuals often rely on idealization as a psychological defense mechanism, projecting exaggerated standards onto romantic partners in order to stabilize a fragile internal sense of worth. By imagining an ideal partner who is emotionally strong, endlessly supportive, and nearly flawless, they unconsciously protect themselves from confronting their own vulnerability, dependency, and unmet emotional needs. This idealization allows them to maintain emotional distance while still believing they are capable of deep attachment, as long as the partner performs the role assigned to them. However, real relationships inevitably involve imperfection, emotional complexity, and moments of weakness, which gradually erode the fantasy of idealization. When this erosion occurs, disappointment sets in quickly, often followed by emotional withdrawal, criticism, or detachment, not because the partner has fundamentally changed, but because the defense has collapsed. Rather than renegotiating intimacy on realistic terms, highly ambitious individuals may interpret this disillusionment as proof that the relationship is flawed or no longer aligned with their growth. In this way, idealization becomes a self-sabotaging loop, preventing the development of stable, grounded intimacy while reinforcing the belief that no partner is ever truly enough. From a psychoanalytic perspective, extreme ambition is frequently rooted in early childhood environments marked by emotional inconsistency, limited validation, or conditional acceptance. In such settings, children learn that love is something to be earned through performance, obedience, or achievement, rather than something freely given. As they grow older, this lesson becomes embedded in their identity, shaping an internal belief that worth must always be proven and security must always be maintained through effort. Even when material resources are sufficient, the absence of emotional safety leaves a deep imprint on the nervous system, making relaxation and vulnerability feel unsafe. As adults, these individuals may excel professionally while struggling to receive care, support, or unconditional affection without discomfort or suspicion. Intimacy triggers old fears of dependency and loss of control, leading them to retreat into achievement as a familiar and safer terrain. Thus, relationships become arenas for self-validation rather than mutual nourishment, repeating the emotional patterns formed during childhood in a more socially acceptable but equally limiting form. For individuals whose identity is built around control, progress, and self-reliance, emotional intimacy can unconsciously activate threat responses rather than feelings of comfort or safety. Closeness requires slowing down, relinquishing control, and allowing another person access to one's emotional world, all of which conflict with the internal survival strategies developed through years of striving. When intimacy deepens, the nervous system may interpret vulnerability as exposure and dependence as danger, triggering subtle defensive behaviors such as emotional withdrawal, hypercriticism, or sudden detachment. These reactions often occur automatically, without conscious intent, leaving partners confused by this sudden shift from warmth to distance. What appears as emotional coldness is frequently a protective reflex designed to restore psychological equilibrium rather than a deliberate rejection of love. Because these individuals are often highly functional in other areas of life, they may rationalize their distancing as logic, realism, or maturity, further masking the underlying fear driving their behavior. Over time, repeated cycles of approach and withdrawal erode trust, making long-term attachment increasingly difficult to sustain. In relationships shaped by unresolved survival anxiety, partners are often unconsciously assigned the role of emotional regulators rather than equals in mutual connection. Highly ambitious individuals may rely on their partners to provide reassurance, admiration, stability, or a sense of safety that they cannot consistently generate within themselves. This dynamic creates an imbalance where one person carries the emotional labor of soothing insecurity, while the other remains focused on performance and control. Although this arrangement may initially feel functional, it gradually depletes the partner's emotional reserves and fosters resentment or emotional exhaustion. Instead of intimacy deepening, the relationship becomes instrumental, centered on maintaining emotional equilibrium rather than fostering shared growth. The partner may begin to feel used, unseen, or valued primarily for the stability they provide, rather than for who they are. Over time, this dynamic undermines genuine attachment, as love is replaced by emotional utility, and connection becomes contingent on one person's ability to manage the other's inner instability. In modern culture, restlessness, dissatisfaction, and the constant pursuit of something better are often praised as signs of vision, intelligence, and inner strength. Yet psychologically, this inability to settle is frequently rooted in unresolved internal conflict rather than genuine growth. Highly ambitious individuals may experience stillness as emptiness and emotional stability as stagnation because their sense of identity has been built around movement, striving, and self-surpassing. As a result, long-term attachment begins to feel restrictive, even threatening, not because the relationship is unhealthy, but because it removes the familiar tension that has long defined their inner world. They may unconsciously believe that fulfillment exists just beyond the next achievement, promotion, or relationship, reinforcing a pattern of perpetual searching. This mindset prevents emotional anchoring, as commitment is experienced as a loss of potential rather than a source of security. Over time, relationships are abandoned not due to conflict, but due to a lingering sense that something better must exist elsewhere, making emotional permanence feel incompatible with self-worth. For highly ambitious individuals, genuine emotional healing does not come from achieving more, refining goals, or optimizing performance, but from developing the capacity to accept themselves without conditions. Only when self-worth is no longer dependent on external validation can intimacy feel safe rather than threatening. This process involves confronting the original survival anxiety that fueled ambition in the first place, and recognizing that love does not require constant proving. Without this internal shift, ambition will continue to dominate emotional life, relegating relationships to secondary roles or functional utilities. Healing requires learning how to remain present without self-rejection, to tolerate vulnerability without fleeing into control, and to value emotional connection as essential rather than expendable. When ambition is no longer driven by fear, attachment becomes possible, not as a compromise, but as a natural extension of internal security.